Hi, I'm Neil Bergman.
And I'm Hayley Bergman. Over the last 10 years, we've helped thousands of fitness professionals to get qualified, learn with simplicity, and coach clients with confidence.
We're the first to say that learning and being a FITPRO doesn't have to be hard work, and that with the right structure, support and resources, you can become a confident and knowledgeable fitness professional that is dedicated to more.
So how do you learn, qualify and kickstart as a FITPRO? This is the FITPRO Sessions podcast with Parallel Coaching.
The 6 steps to planning. I am super excited for this episode because the amount of people that reach out to us on a weekly basis, monthly basis, struggling with their level 3 portfolios of like, what exercise do I put in here? How do I put this program card together? I'm not sure if this exercise is going to work. What's the best exercise for this goal? Will this work? And kind of so many questions get conjured up when it comes to planning, programming.
Especially around exercises, aren't they?
Yes.
So because there's so many questions about exercises, it's essentially causing so much overwhelm.
And this episode specifically is going to give you a 6-step process to cut all of that overwhelm out and nail down your programming like that.
Yeah, exactly.
In 6 steps. And you might think, but will I always do these 6 steps? Those 6 steps could be tough. When we go through each step, you'll realize actually each step is more of a thought and consideration in the process to planning.
Yes.
It's not a case of I've got to spend ages doing step 1, I've got to spend ages doing step 2 before I can get into the nuts and bolts of planning. It's when you sit down and write the plan, the 6 considerations to think about to get to the correct exercise.
And they're all part and parcel of the same thing. I really like the analogy of the haystack and the needle. So you know when you're looking for a needle
or is it the needle in the haystack?
The needle in the haystack. The haystack and the needle. I don't know.
Because that would be like the washing up is in the washing up bowl. Of a bowl of washing up. It's a bit backwards.
The needle the needle in the haystack. So
the garage and the car. Or the car and the garage. Sorry. Look at the pot with the flowers in it. Or is it a flower pot? Sorry.
God. Do you ever get words the wrong way around?
No, I do all the time, but it's just really funny.
Okay, so
we will go after the needle in the haystack.
Often when people have an exercise-based question about planning and they're asking, like you said a minute ago, what's the best exercise for my clients? What's the worst exercise for this? Whatever it might be. They're looking at it upside down and they find like planning like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So you basically have this haystack trying to search for a needle, which is the perfect exercise, right? Amongst all the options of all the exercises. But what I like is that what we're going to show you today is how you're going to turn that upside down so that by having the exercises last, you're basically left holding the needle, looking at a haystack.
Oh, I like that.
So you're holding the needle, looking at the haystack, knowing that you've got the right thing from the beginning.
Actually, I'm going to take back all of my Mickey taking.
It's a haystack and the needle.
No, I'm going to give you a high five. Fist pump.
You.
So what we're saying here is most FITPROs go into the haystack looking for the needle. What we're going to propose today is through these 6 steps, you go through the 6 steps and you pick up the needle straight away and you go, oh, look, I found it. It's quite straightforward.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, like the top question I get asked is what's the best exercise and then insert X. What's the best exercise for weight loss? What's the best exercise for legs? What's the best exercise for an
dodgy knee? Exactly.
But there is no best exercise. There's only safe, effective and appropriate.
There's the
and so we need to go through these 6 steps as a FITPRO to figure out what is the safest exercise, what's the most effective exercise, what's the most appropriate exercise for that client. Like if we look at it and go, what's the best exercise to lose weight? There is no best exercise. Just move. Yeah. That could be walking for one person, swimming for another. It could be resistance training for one person, or it could be yoga for another. At the end of the day, we're looking at creating a caloric deficit. And so how you go about that, it's got to be the most enjoyable exercise, which means it will be the most sustainable and one you adhere to.
And there's so much more stuff before we get to the individual exercise that determines whether someone gets their goal or not.
Yes.
It's almost irrelevant whether they do a squat or a lunge, as long as they're working those muscles and they've got the frequency, the intensity, the time, the type, all the other variables in place, they'll get the goal they wanted. So the exercise becomes irrelevant.
There's also this kind of like thing I recognised more so in the last couple of years. I mean, I've been teaching FITPROs now for over a decade, so have you.
Getting old.
And but the principles haven't changed. So what I mean by that is like so many FITPROs go through the level 2, level 3, and then almost revert back to the way they think or thought in the first place they should have been doing planning. And it's and not to follow on something they learnt on course, if that makes sense. So let's jump into that. Let's jump into it. First off, you've got a client. Let's just say it doesn't matter what your client's goal is. Just think of your ideal client. Think of a client you've got at the moment. What's their goal? They have a current start point. That's their current status. So let's call that week 1 or week 0. And then you might say, right, in 8 weeks' time, they're going to have achieved their ideal goal. So that could be to have run 10K. That could be to have dropped a certain amount of weight, to have lost about a certain fat percentage. That could be a waist circumference. That could be to get faster, fit. It doesn't matter what the goal is, but they have a current start status. And we have an end status or an ideal where we'd like them to get to, or where they want to get to rather.
And it's really important in that time and space that you're putting towards goals, you find out what they really want. And you'll know this if you've ever started with a client. You start working with them for one goal and then it comes out the woodwork like, this is what I really meant. This is what's really important to me. And you have to kind of change where you're at. So it's really important to find out what is it they actually really want.
Which we've done another podcast on that, and there's various blogs around their surface level goals and then what is the underlying goal below that. So let's jump back to that the start point. What's their current status? This is where we need to have some kind of measuring, managing or monitoring process in place where we might take subjective data, we might do some questionnaires, we might do an interview style consultation, and then we might have some objective assessments whereby we might do some static ones, which might include, their waist, their hip circumference, chest circumference, their height, weight, their BMI, their blood pressure, fat caliper testing. There's loads of static objective tests you could do, and then you could do some movement or dynamic objective tests. So that could be for your runner, that might be a 12-minute Cooper run test, it could be a Rockport walk test, it could be a repetition max test, it could be a range of movement test, a squat assessment. But ultimately what we're trying to assess here is say we've got a client's goal, we know where we want to get to, we can now select appropriate tests, objective and subjective, in the early stage to figure out their current status. Without this start point, we don't know where their anatomy and physiology is. You might go, there he is again. Anatomy. But ultimately, we've got to figure out which one of the body's anatomical systems and body's physiological systems, how these parts work together, we need to adapt. So let's say, for example, you've got a runner. They currently, let's just say we do a Cooper run test, a 12-minute Cooper run test, and we ascertain their VO2 max, the volume of oxygen they can take in, transport and utilise for their age group, pumps out a normative score of, let's just say, 45. And let's just say they are at the top end of their average of their age group. And they want to improve on their 10K run time. We can now select appropriate training systems and go through the other 5 steps, which I'll park that there, okay? In order to challenge their anaerobic threshold, which is going to challenge their VO2 max. I mean, in 4 weeks' time, I could do the same test, which means it's valid, accurate, and reliable, to then make judgments of, are we heading in the right direction? Is my client getting fitter, stronger, leaner, and meaner? Yes or no? And then in 4 weeks' time after that, week 8, they have a planned race or a planned time trial or another test where I can measure, manage, and monitor to clearly say, based on week's one status, we've improved VO2 in week 4. We went from 45 to 46, and then 4 weeks later in week 8, we got to 48. But that would be a clear sign, a tangible sign with an arbitrary number against normative data that says, yes, my client is improving.
What I like about that is you mentioned measure, manage, monitor. Is all part of the goal setting. It's all part of understanding how they're progressing.
Otherwise, you're guessing and you're flying by the seat of your pants.
And you're not managing it.
And you're not managing it. So let's say, for example, if a client has a weight loss goal, we need to measure weight. And that might trigger you, and that's okay. And you might disagree with me, that's equally okay. But if a client has a goal and there's a weight loss goal, I, the coach, must first and foremost know what that weight is. The client might stand on the scales backwards. It's not about being fixed to a number and attaching my self-worth or my happiness to that number. But as a coach, we need
That's what
to...
the goal is.
But
you need to measure it.
But it's not about attaching any emotion to it. It's about having an arbitrary start point number, a status test, and saying, this is the weight. Whatever that weight is, it doesn't matter what the number is. It's the facts. And now we can, through a nutritional, physical activity, NEAT, and whatever approach, we can improve on that number. But that number doesn't mean that my happiness or self-worth or confidence is attached to it. It just means as a coach, I'm looking at a number, which is the facts of my weight at that moment in time.
Perfect. And that's step one.
That's
so step one is goal. Now what I want you to imagine is with each of these steps that they're arranged in a pyramid order, because it's so important, goal at the bottom of this.
Yeah.
It's the foundation before you can go up through. So the next one...
we're going to pause you there, because if you said, like, let's say the goal was running, then I need to select tests, objective, subjective tests relevant to running. There would be no point doing, for example, fat caliper tests for my marathon runner.
No.
Okay.
Yes, it's got to be relevant to the goal. Else you're not measuring, managing and monitoring that goal.
So
you're
I must
managing
know
something
the
else.
first point with the goal is not just to be clear on what the primary, secondary goals are, it's to be clear on what it is I'm going to test. Okay.
And what
make
do you
sure,
expect to see?
Yes. Where is their status point in week 1, week 0? What do we expect to see by week 4, week 8, and so forth?
Wicked.
Step 2.
Step 2 is about adaptation. Here we go again. Anatomical and physiological adaptation is key. There's no, like, if somebody wanted to stay exactly the same on their anatomy and their physiology, they wouldn't come to you and have a goal to change.
Yes.
So we are in agreement.
Well, that's why they're actually... They don't articulate it. They turn around and go, I want to lose weight. But ultimately what they're saying is, I want to change my anatomy and physiology to be a different size, like this now.
Or to be faster, fitter, stronger,
and
leaner,
like this
leaner.
now.
Yes, exactly. So where this section is where you're going to decode their message from being their goal to now what physiological adaptation has to happen to get them from their A to their B. So from their start point to their goal. And I like to chunk this up into some zones really, but essentially what you're looking at is the adaptation of the muscle fiber types and the adaptation of the energy systems to help them, and lots of other areas, but they're the ones we can really control via the variables of
range of motion on the joints.
Range of motion becomes part of it.
So you could say the client wants to, for example, go on a yoga retreat. Okay, and the yoga retreat thereafter is an intermediate advanced one, but they're not quite at that intermediate level. So you could do some range of movement testing and specific yoga flow movements and poses to ascertain where they are now and say, right, the anatomical physiological adaptation is an improvement of range of movement in certain joints and therefore certain muscles.
Nice.
Over time.
And then the other type of goal, let's just say somebody wants to be able to go from doing a half marathon to a full marathon.
Yeah.
Lovely, like endurance-based goal. So you know you want to be working aerobically with them, right?
Yeah.
They've got to stay aerobic for that time.
Yeah.
So that's your physiological adaptation, is they want to improve their capacity inside their aerobic energy systems.
We want to improve capillaries. We want to improve their type 1 muscle fiber recruitment. We want to improve, potentially decrease blood pressure. We want to improve cardiac output, stroke volume.
Yeah. You have somebody that wants to build muscle, you need to challenge their type 2A muscle fibers. And with that, their lactic acid energy system. So you're more in that anaerobic zone. Or you get someone with strength and power, it's going to be right at the top. You're going to be doing type 2B muscle fibers, really explosive.
So in your level 2 and level 3 anatomy and physiology exam, you had 8 modules. All of those, I'm going to say, if you look at those skeletal joints, you've got energy systems, the muscular system, you had body in motion with planes of movement, axis of movement. And all of those, all 8, I suppose, are wrapped up into one, which was the central nervous system. Because at the end of the day, the exercise you give and the variables that you train within that exercise are going to give a stress or a stimulus on the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. The brain will then decode this new stress. And if the stress is consistently deployed, the central nervous system will make adaptations to the anatomy and physiology to meet the demand of that stress and therefore improve. So I like to think of this as like, the body is like water running downhill. We will take the least path of resistance. And in doing so, this analogy in terms of like the central nervous system challenging or changing anatomy and physiology. If a new stress is brought about, it will find the least path of resistance, and therefore it will lay down more muscle, or improve capillarization. The body is an incredible machine at finding the least path of resistance, and therefore it will adapt to its new stress.
And then it goes, oh, I'm better at doing that now. It won't be as hard to do that same thing.
And you come along with a logically progressed plan, which has marginal 1% gains every week, okay, or every session, whereby the stress is just beyond that. It's just overreachable for the brain, and therefore it's always got this constant stimulus that doesn't bring about a plateau or burnout.
Yeah, and then before you know it, you've got physiological adaptation that leads you from point A to point B. And what I really love about this, as we go up through the other sections, that you'll see how each of these steps means that it really is not about the exercise.
No. So far we've done goals, and we've looked at the anatomical. What do we want to change anatomically? What do we want to change physiologically? Because at the moment we could say for your runner, they've got a VO2 max of 45. We want to, that's the arbitrary number that allows us to say this is the ability of taking in oxygen, transporting and utilizing it. So we're clearly looking at the cardiorespiratory system. So to improve on our time, on our runner, improve on our VO2 max score, ultimately improve our ability to take in oxygen, transport said oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide and get rid of that, and utilize it within the energy systems. That's what we're really changing, which is why we need to have a test to see what's going on. Otherwise we are still guessing.
And then when we retest, we now know that yes, we challenged it adequately, or no, we didn't challenge it enough.
And therefore we can change our plan and go from there.
Nice.
Now, step number 3 goes back right to the day dot of your FITPRO journey, and we're looking at your FITT principle. Because now we can ascertain, based on their goal, based on the adaptation, how many times a week should they ideally be training, and how many times a week can they train? And there might be a discrepancy there. So for example, they might go, well, I can only train twice a week. But in an ideal world, you think, well, in an ideal world, they want to train 3 or 4 times a week. But remember, if the exercise you choose eventually is fun and enjoyable, they're more likely to do more of it. So we could roll with resistance in the first mesocycle and say, well, for the next 4 weeks, we're trained twice per week. But as you enjoy exercise and you change your values and priorities towards this new fun and enjoyable approach, the client may find themselves finding time to place the 3rd or 4th session in. So my advice is, again, we're going to the exercise last. Don't go to the exercise first, because if you really want your client to improve their frequency, take this 6-step approach.
Yeah, and what I like about using this section in FITT priority, really you're finding what's the priority they need. Like you focused on frequency then, but it could be for that runner that's going from half marathon up to
intensity.
Marathon. It could be intensity.
Let's go intensity so it stays at FITT.
Okay, cool. Intensity.
Now I'm going to sneeze and I'm going to keep it.
I wonder what you were looking for.
Excuse me. I'm going to keep it in. I'm not going to edit that out.
When you were looking at me, I was like, what
I'm going to sneeze.
What are you subliminally telling me?
I apologise if that just sounded disgusting in your ears.
It would have been fine.
I deeply apologise,
So,
actually. I'm still not going to edit it out.
Let me change my example. So if we're talking about intensity, I'm going to take the hypertrophy example here. So if you've got somebody that wants to build muscle and they're currently, I don't know, doing 15 rep max when they go to the gym and they're kind of in that endurance zone, then your first goal has to be to start increasing the intensity they're training at. So we've got to increase the load. We've got to also change the rep range so they're now firmly in that hypertrophy zone, which is the intensity.
They have an inverse relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, so as reps change, the resistance also must change.
Yes. We don't just do less reps and keep the resistance
No,
the same.
completely. So if you go from 15 reps to 12 reps, then you must change your load.
Yes.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah. They have an inverse relationship.
Yeah,
they
so
go
the
hand in hand.
intensity gets harder.
But intensity would be your next after frequency, because it would be better to have the client have more frequency of a more enjoyable exercise than really challenge the intensity. Because again, they go hand in hand as an inverse relationship. As volume, frequency goes up, intensity comes down, or as intensity goes up, frequency and volume comes down. So they go in yin and yang, bicep and tricep.
And that's that dose response, isn't it? The sweet spot between the frequency and the intensity means that you find that sweet spot.
people had taught me this at my FITT principle and deep in level 2. Do you know what I mean?
Wouldn't it be lovely?
Anyway, we can moan about training providers another day.
Next one is time.
I'm going to do type.
Oh, you like type
I
first?
like type first. So what's the type of exercise that's beneficial towards the adaptation, what we're after? What's the type of modality, the movement that is beneficial towards the goal? So if a client's got a running goal, it would make sense to choose more running in a sagittal plane. But then you could say, well, what would be another modality that would be non-weight bearing that the client also enjoys? So now you can see we're starting to brainstorm in step number 3 of modalities or types of exercise. We're not saying pinpointing, we're going to do leg press. We might just say resistance machines or free weights.
You might also here say, I'm going to do an upper body, lower body split, or I'm doing whole body sessions, or I'm doing just mostly cardio, or I'm doing yoga. Like, what's the overall kind
What's the global parachute heading?
Yeah, how are you going to organise
the 10,000 foot view. And then the final one would be time. Like right now, in the current status,
I said it 3 times.
would be time of like, go back to step 1 and think like, in my subjective questionnaires, ask the client, how long have you been training? What's your training age? What's your training history? And how much time do you spend each session and each week training? Because now you can ascertain like this kind of like muscle memory, the amount of agility, balance and coordination that's gone into the body, the amount of steps or miles or load that has been taken into the body over the last number of days, months, weeks or years and so forth. But also, how much time do I spend training in the micro, like today? Because if your client is only used to 30-minute sessions, then we're going to start off in the first mesocycle at 30-minute sessions, because we're going to roll with resistance, remember, and pick an exercise session that is similar to what they've been doing, which means the adherence goes up, and now I just have to work on coaching them and making it really fun inside that session to progress it later. But time is a really easy one to progress.
It is.
An example of this is in my own training, in my running, I did a lot of ultra runs. So I would start off at the beginning of the season, I'd say to Hayley, I'm going to go out and do my 5K run. And I might come back inside 20 minutes. And I might do that for a week or 2. And then I might start to progress my long runs from 5K. But every session, I might just improve it by the time by, let's just say, 10 minutes. Or 5 minutes. Or even just a couple of minutes. But let's just say I improved my time by 1 minute every session and I went out every day. On the first time I go out for like, let's just say 20 minutes. But in 365 days time, I've actually got my 365 plus my 20 minutes. So I've got 385 minutes. But each day,
don't even know how many hours that is.
It was achievable and realistic just to go for a further 60 seconds. But also for loved ones and family and friends around me, it was of no major burden on anyone's time when I just went out for an additional 60 seconds. So, for example, in the first week,
social impact of it.
For the first week I go out, it's just 20 minutes. But in 7 days' time, it's 27 minutes. But it's no biggie every day.
What I love about that is it's not just that social impact that you've shown about here, like of friends, family, but also the stressor. You said about what's the 1% I could add each time.
The marginal gains.
And if you're focusing on time or duration as the thing you want to be as your main priority in training and the main adaptation you want to see, then it would make sense, wouldn't it?
Completely.
Just like 1% added.
But then if a client's got, for example, a power or strength or hypertrophy goal, then time and duration inside a session might not be the main variable. We might have to look at time under tension of certain exercises and say, well, actually, the time of each session is going to remain constant at 45 minutes. Therefore, I must now look at the type, the intensity and frequency. So your FITT principle is step number 3. I'm going to say hold for gateways to all of your logical progression.
And find your priority.
Now, step number 4 is where all these variables do come in. And we've talked about this before. You've got your 5 R's and a V. So your 5 R's are reps, resistance, range of movement, rate, and rest. Your V is volume, which would be the volume of miles, the volume of sets, the volume of overall load throughout the session. So total number of pounds or kilos lifted, for example.
So now we're not talking about in between sessions necessarily. We're talking about the variables that happen in a session.
Because FITT did the logical progression across a week or a month or a meso or micro cycle. Now we're looking at micro inside a session.
And that this sort of variables also takes into account training systems, because training systems are just a group of variables.
Exactly.
So you take a superset, all they've done is change one of those variables, which is rest. Rest gets stripped out, and now you've got, say, these two either opposing muscles back to back, or you've got things like trisets that take out the rest, and you've got lots of exercises.
This is where we could
muscle.
have a very quick discussion around why we need to know anatomy and physiology as well, because quite often we get, why does a superset have to be opposing muscles? Well, an agonist-antagonist superset would be opposing muscles because you get the law of reciprocal inhibition, which is where one muscle contracts, the opposing muscle, its pairing muscle, must lengthen and relax. And they go, it's like yin and yang. Think about it, as my bicep contracts, in order to bring about elbow flexion, my tricep must lengthen, which is actually going through elbow, what would be?
Well, what did you say?
Flexion, completely,
flexion.
Yeah, which is lengthening. And so one can't do it without the other. And that's the benefit of the superset, because one gets maximum length through the range of movement, which means when I go back, I can get maximum contraction.
It's had the most rest. It's the most rested it could be.
Because it's had to lengthen and fully switch off.
But it feels like there wasn't any rest neurologically because your nervous system is still working. So that's still great for all of those areas.
So inside this step, which is step number 1, 2, 3, 4, we're looking at the variables. Like if your client's got an endurance goal, then we want to placing an endurance training system, endurance rep ranges. We want endurance time under tension, endurance range of movement. Like, what is the range of movement specific to your client's run? Have they got lots of steep steps in there? In which case, we've got to analyze joint actions. How much ankle, knee, and hip flexion extension happens? Is it all within one plane? Like, what's going on? This is now analyzing the movements to bring about the perfect dose of 5Rs and 1V.
Yeah.
Like, if your client's got a hypertrophy goal, then are they sitting at a comfortable 12 rep max? Have we got their actual
is the
overload
right?
Have
is the time under tension
completely.
right for them, which is the rate?
How are we going to progress from there?
Exactly. So you pick the relevant variables as you're kind of progressing through it. And what I love about this is that these variables are not just random tactics. It's not just like, I'm just going to pick this training system. This is a funky one. I like this one. You're not just picking those random variables. They still relate to the bit underneath, the FITT priority. They still relate to the adaptation. That still relates to the goal. So it all has to account for everything underneath it. And this reminds me of, Neil and I were both training for a half marathon, our first half marathon, many moons ago, 2009.
2009, I know what you're about to talk about.
We thought that, like, Neil was, I was like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do the running miles. I'm just going to run and I'm going to gradually build up my mileage to do it. And I had a PB beforehand, and which we tested as our first goal. So we've both done our full half marathon as a test, right?
Now, this stage, I was addicted. Is this where we're going to?
Yeah, but I was partway through saying it, but it's fine.
You can go for it if you want.
Good, okay. So we had our
I
first
might want to say
part.
it though. Do you want
Yeah, go for it.
No, you say
it. So the first section was that we both had to test it.
Yes.
So we both tested. Although I was a slower run overall, we both had a PB time, right?
So it wasn't a PB against each other. It wasn't say who could run the fastest. It was who could improve on their PB percentage the most.
The incremental improvement on their own PB. Now, I trained for it via running as my exercise, but the main thing was that I focused in the right energy systems and everything else that I needed to do. Neil?
I just, at this point, was like, and still am somewhat like, I really love training with kettlebells. So I thought I would just use kettlebells and mimic, stay in the sagittal plane, which running is, and really focus on key joints and moving with kettlebell. But again, focusing on energy systems that would benefit me for the long run. Now, come race day, I'd done very little to no running at this point. Which I tell you after was not the best idea, because obviously out of all of us, I think once we'd finished, Hayley recovered the quickest because she had done more impactive work than me. However, from a PB perspective, percentage-wise, I progressed more, okay, because of the training specificity behind the anatomical and physiological adaptation.
So my training was like, I'm just going to go out for a run because the more I run, the better, right?
So though
I didn't
it was
think
specific,
about energy systems. I didn't think about all of the variables needed to keep me in the right adaptation. Neil looked at the adaptation and not the exercise, and actually progressed better than I did, because all I looked at was the exercise.
But this comes down, so you can only really figure out your 5 R's and a V and the other variables if you understand how that fits within your logically progressed FITT principle. You can only progress your FITT principle if you know what adaptation you want to work for, and you can only understand the adaptation if you've tested, measured, managed and monitored, and you know where you're heading with your goal with an end goal in sight.
Yes.
Now,
so that was number 4, so let's go to number 5.
Is for considerations. Now, there's just final considerations here, and we've kind of dropped these in already to some degree. So something we haven't discussed in detail is things like, what plane of movement are we biased towards? What axis of movement is attached to that? For example, it doesn't matter what exercise you do, if it's in a sagittal plane, it's always going to be in a medial lateral axis. The axes are bound together like super glue with their plane of motion.
Describe the same thing.
But if my goal is, for example, I got a swimming goal, then I know that I'm going to be, and I'm on front crawl, predominantly I'm in a sagittal and maybe some, you could argue all 3 planes of movement. But what's the dominant plane of movement? And now I could take my 5 R's and a V, and now I can take my FITT principle, my adaptation, and think, right, what is it about the sagittal plane? What joints are moving? If joints act, muscles react. What are the main muscles in play here in stage number 5? Not just the plane of motion, but what joints are really biased to moving? What joint range of motion do they go through? What prime movers am I really working with here?
And I remember one example of this really clearly, because Neil had a client that was a hockey goalkeeper.
Yes.
And she basically, in hockey, in goal, she was doing loads of frontal plane movements. So side to side movement as one of her main things. Yes, there was lunging. Yes, there was bits forward. But the main development is that agility on the side to side. So here you go, right, consideration, what movements are in that plane of motion? What do I need to consider? So it makes you think, actually, most goals or some goals will be sagittal, some goals will have more frontal, some goals will have more transverse.
I'll tell you about another story about another client who had done a couple of Ironmans before, got some really good times on Ironman and wanted to go back and get a PB. But when we analysed the previous 2 Ironmans he did, it was for transitions that he was losing time over.
That's the consideration.
And that was the consideration. So then we went back to the goal and we said, okay, so we're looking for a PB. We'd already got good swim times. He'd already got good bike times. And he'd already got good run times. Now, there was some marginal gains to be made there. But when we looked at the time spent in transition time, there was lots of improvement to have. Now, if you think about swimming, cycling and running, it's all in a sagittal plane. So when we did some of the earlier tests, okay, I made up my own tests. We looked at a frontal plane test and a transverse plane test inside the specificity of Ironman transitions. Now we've got our new goal. Okay, then the adaptation was around the certain joints that are prone to injury inside the transition, but also looking at speed. Now, the moment you start speeding things up is the moment you start increasing the risk of injury.
Yeah.
And in the moment of the adrenaline of a race, that's when things were starting to slow down and the fatigue completely. So then we looked at the FITT principle and said, right, if we're going to progress the marginal gains in the 3 disciplines, we also need an additional 1 session here just on transition times, and that's the 1 session I'm going to work with you.
Wicked.
We then looked at the variables of 5 R's and a V, and the considerations were within what what plane of motion, what axis of movement are we going to work within, but also really considering what joints need more stability. What joints need more range of movement or flexibility, okay? And therefore, what are my prime movers coming out of this?
Yes.
Fast forward to the selection of exercises now were not relevant.
Yeah.
Okay, it was about the anatomical and physiological adaptation specific towards the goal.
And how you make that
lo and behold, went back and did I think it was a 16-week plan. We did various tests along the way, okay? So it was the transition of getting out of the water and onto the bike, getting off the bike in a fatigue state and getting into the shoes. So they'd all be different progressions, okay, and so forth. Now, fast forward to actually doing the Ironman, he finished having radically improved his time by something like almost, I think it was 90 minutes or something
and
like
less
that.
flustered on his transitions too, from a subjective point of view.
Well, that's what it was coming down to,
Yeah.
wasn't it? It wasn't just, there was objective and subjective, but also enjoying the transition, knowing that he wasn't letting himself down necessarily inside the marginal gains of the 3 disciplines.
Yeah, nice.
Now then,
I got,
considerations, go for it.
there is another part of considerations that if your client has conditions, so medical conditions, long-term conditions, they come with certain rules.
Yeah.
So these are exercises you can't do, for example, intensities you can't get to.
Perfect.
And
yes.
this is where you would remind yourself of any rules associated to that client or their conditions.
Wicked. So
it's consideration, isn't it?
which is scope of practice, because you might say, well, I'm working with a runner, but the runner is on a certain medication to lower their blood pressure. Now they're on medication, they actually refer a PARQ, and without the long-term supporting clients qualification to cover your knowledge and confidence, but also your insurance, regardless, you still can't work with that person.
Well, yeah.
So this is the final step to say, am I capable of working with this client inside the rules of this client?
And if you know you are capable and they've already been cleared, you now know the rules that go with it.
Yes.
But don't forget to remind yourself. The amount of people I've worked with that they've even in their case study, they've gone through all the consultation, they've got the goals, the plan looks fantastic on the overview, and they put together a program card. I'm like, but why have you put overhead work for someone with hypertension, for example?
Perfect.
And they go, oh, I totally forgot. I just went straight in with what I knew would get the goal. And just forgot to remind themselves of the rules.
So step 5 is considerations, the final bits of anatomy and physiology that aren't covered in the previous 4 steps, but more so the rules of who is my individual in front of me. And go from there.
Remind yourself.
Now we move to step number 6. We can
the
select the exercise, and you can now see that the exercise is, dare I say, almost relevant. And what I mean by that is, if you know the client's goal, which was step 1, you now know the client's adaptation that you want to force through their anatomy and physiology brought about by the stress of training. You can then figure out the FITT principle, the 5 R's and the V, and any other considerations. We can now clearly say, well, the best exercise for this person would be blah. There is no best exercise. The best
Today
exercise,
I'm going to choose X.
well, I'm going to say is the best exercise is one that ticks the box of the previous 5 steps.
Yeah, and you want to remember those previous 5 steps when you do it.
Because you're going to choose an exercise based on what the prime mover is. You're going to pick an exercise, how that fits into a training system.
Whether you've chosen to do whole body
You're
approach.
going to pick an exercise based on what joint is going to be predominantly worked.
Yeah.
What plane of movement you're going to move within and the axis of movement. You're going to pick an exercise based on the rules of that client, of what you can or cannot do with that particular person, or their injuries, or their niggles, or their medications. You're then going to, like you say, pick an exercise based on, is it a lower body day, an upper body day? You're going to pick an exercise based on the training systems that are relevant to the client and they're logically progressed. You're going to pick an exercise based on where they are right now. You're going to pick an exercise based on what they enjoy. And it doesn't matter. You could do, there's no need to look at this and go, well, what's the best exercise? What's another exercise for a squat? What's another exercise for a quad? That's the upside down pyramid of looking at it. You're looking at it from an exercise perspective, and then you're thinking, well, how would this work? Is there another exercise in terms of to get this client the goal?
Yeah.
Rather than go goal, adaptations, FITT, 5 R's and a V, considerations, then the exercise becomes relevant.
There you
Boom.
go. 6 steps. So if you take that pyramid approach, we were just talking about all 6 of those. Can you see that potentially
They can't see, they could hear. They're on YouTube.
If you're on YouTube, you can see it.
Yep.
If you're on podcast, you can hear it. Can you hear that you have this like pyramid effect when you do it the right way around? It's a really stable base, and as you go up, it takes all the information. If you're doing it upside down and you have the exercises at the bottom, you have a really unstable base, which basically makes you very overwhelmed.
Because you're like, I could pick a gazillion leg exercises, a gazillion prime mover quad.
Right?
It's the haystack. So you can either walk into the barn, go through the 6 steps and go straight to the needle and pick up the needle and go, that's the best exercise for my client today based on the pyramid approach. Or you can walk into the barn and go, what's the best exercise? You've got this huge pile of hay and you're trying to figure out, well, would this work? Would that work? And that's when overwhelm kicks in. What I really love about today's episode is I suppose we've tackled a question from our FITPRO 31 program.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of people ask why it's called FITPRO 31. We launched it in May. May has 31 days. It doesn't mean anything. You can do it in under 6 hours if you wanted to. And we have a lot of people join and I suppose binge watch for tutorials, which take you through. First off, tutorial 1 is all about consultation.
Oh, no, that's the bottom part of the pyramid.
Bottom part of the pyramid. The next one is all about nutrition, okay, and digesting nutrition, no pun intended. Tutorials 3 and 4 are all about the macro and micro of planning. So we go into all of the 5 R's and the V. We absolutely dissect this to pieces. We go through all of the training systems and logical progression inside a logically progressed plan. And then step number 5 or tutorial 5 is all of the mindset or glue that sticks it together and the behavior change. So I suppose if I was to summarize FITPRO 31, if you are stuck with your planning, in terms of your level 3 PT or any component of planning at level 2, yoga, Pilates, FITPRO 31 has you covered. But also if you're new to the industry and still feel like you're trying to find the needle in a haystack,
there you go.
It's not just a case of a refresher based on what you already know. It's about putting round pegs in round holes and square pegs in square holes and saying, this is what that means. And
so it's about having a strategy, isn't it?
It's about making it,
a lot of people, when they go through, let's just take level 3 PT, for example, it's appropriate across all of the FITPRO genres. But basically, if you go, right, level 3 PT, I'm doing my case study, you learn how to complete the assessment paperwork, but you don't necessarily leave with a strategy that says, I could do this, followed by this, and then I get a client goal and I can guarantee that goal.
Yeah, perfect.
And what we find is that quite often the stumbling block that stops people from going and getting started in the industry
is applying the knowledge.
Applying the knowledge, and they're not feeling confident because they couldn't say, well, I'll guarantee you this goal, I can get you that goal, because they don't know the link between the goal, the planning, the adaptation physiological and the planning, which we've just shared with you now. So you've kind of got that link and the strategy to follow, and that then brings it all together so you can actually go, you know what, I know what I'm doing. I think
this is
now.
This is a point I think for most training providers. Maybe it's a different podcast episode of FITPRO session, but ultimately it's linking the anatomy and physiology, the nutrition exams, with the principles of training, with the case study of what you're doing. So you walk out of the course. In an ideal world, this would be that you go, okay, so I learned this about energy systems in my exam or in my anatomy, but that links to my planning, and my planning links to my client goal and outcome, all underpinned by the knowledge I learned in the 8 modules.
Wicked.
So there we go. Cool.
Just like that.
I really know what your I want to know what your takeaway is. Like, what did you learn today? What was your big 1, 2, or 3 big takeaways? Because it's all very well me and Hayley having this good old chin wag and talking to ourselves in our office, okay, randomly to a camera. And I know that hundreds of people, thousands of people are going to download this, but I really want to know what your big takeaway is. So I really appreciate the comments that come in on Messenger, on email. You can email us info@parallel-coaching.com or hayley@parallelcoaching.co.uk. You could go into our Facebook Inner Circle and drop a comment in there, because it's all very well listening to something, but if you can articulate your big aha moment back, you actually learn far quicker and it stays with you and it sticks in your mind. There's a bit of a memory hack, isn't it? It's a nice memory hack. If you're struggling with learning anything, we learn what we hear ourselves say. So maybe you're learning something about muscles and you can't figure muscles out, but the moment you start to say it, or you articulate it and write it back, or say it to somebody else, you'll learn it far quicker.
Yeah.
So I want to know what your big takeaway's been.
Yes. So drop a comment. Let us know what that big takeaway is. And if you haven't already left us a 5-star review on iTunes, make sure you go and do it.
It's so easy.
If you're watching us on YouTube, then all you have to do is click the subscribe button, and then you get information or like little notifications when we're live again next time, or when we put the next podcast episode out, or any other videos along the way.
It's not about an arbitrary follow, and I love those 5-star reviews.
It's about staying connected.
But it's about staying connected, but it's also about spreading the word and beating the parallel drum, because if you've found value in this, then hopefully others will as well. Boom. We'll see you next week. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you later.
Bye.
Hi, I'm Neil Bergman.
And I'm Hayley Bergman. Over the last 10 years, we've helped thousands of fitness professionals to get qualified, learn with simplicity, and coach clients with confidence.
We're the first to say that learning and being a FITPRO doesn't have to be hard work, and that with the right structure, support and resources, you can become a confident and knowledgeable fitness professional that is dedicated to more.
So how do you learn, qualify and kickstart as a FITPRO? This is the FITPRO Sessions podcast with Parallel Coaching.